Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Ben Frost. I'm the Professional Development Officer for APA's Northern New England chapter, and I'm one of the coordinators of the National Planning Webcast Series, which is sponsored by over 40 different chapters and divisions of APA, but is not itself formally affiliated with the American Planning Association. I'll be the moderator for today's webcast. Today is Friday, June 19th, 2015, and we'll hear the presentation, An Urgent Call for Healthy Communities. So for technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions into the chat box found in the webcast toolbar on the right side of your screen. Or if you have truly technical questions, which I can't help you with, feel free to call the 1-800 number, which will connect you to the folks at GoToWebinar. For content-related questions during the presentation, please type those questions type your questions in the question box, also located in the webinar toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen. We will answer those questions at the end of the webcast during our Q&A portion. On your screen now is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions, and it is a growing number as we add more and more chapters and divisions to our ranks. I want to thank all of the sponsors for the support of this Planning Webcast Series Consortium. Certainly without this group, we could not be pulling off these free webcasts almost every week throughout the year. And today, we are sponsored by the Michigan chapter. To learn more about chapters or divisions, you can type in those links on your own computers to find out how to join, become a member of a division, or of a chapter. We have a few upcoming webcasts. In fact, every Friday for the rest of the year is booked with webcasts. We have a terrific slate of topics coming up, and this is just a few in the near future for you to sign up and get CM credit for. Also note that we have a new web address. The webcast series is now being hosted by the Ohio chapter of the APA at that link at the bottom of the screen. To log your CM credits for today, go to your APA dashboard. You can select activities by provider, and for this webcast, select Michigan chapter and find the title Urgent Call for Healthy Communities, or you can search by the event number, which is 30205. And this webcast is approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. You can like us on Facebook, as have a lot of people, and that may be the best way to get up-to-date information on the Planning Webcast Series and upcoming webcasts. We are recording today's webcast, and it will be available on our YouTube channel at that link. A PDF of today's presentation is also available on the Ohio Planning chapter website. And now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Mark Fenton. Mark is a nationally recognized public health, planning, and transportation consultant, adjunct associate professor at Tufts University, advocate for active transportation, and former host of America's Walking on PBS television. He's consulted with the University of North Carolina's National Center for Safe Routes to School and Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center, and has led training and planning processes for pedestrian, bicycle, and transit-friendly designs in communities across the United States. He studied engineering and biomechanics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and U.S. Olympic Training Center, was manager of the Human Performance Laboratory at Reebok, and has published numerous articles and books related to exercise science, physical activity promotion, and community interventions. He also tries to practice what he preaches, serving on his community's planning board and walking or cycling for as many routine trips as possible. His website is www.markfenton.com, and you can find him on Facebook under the username r.markfenton. Mark, welcome to the webcast.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Ben. It's a privilege to be with you guys, and I've got to thank all of the sponsors, the chapters that pulled this together, as well as specifically the Michigan chapter. I was privileged to speak at an event called the Michigan Transportation Bonanza. I'd never spoken at a bonanza before. It was very exciting, but it was really a lot of fun. And they suggested that some of the content that I covered there, this kind of nexus between public health, planning, transportation, which I'm sure lots of the folks on the call have had some work in, maybe doing lots. It's a hot topic right now, and as you and I were talking about before, one of the reasons is because there are resources available. We're seeing, for example, the Centers for Disease Control, who I do a lot of work with nationally, has funded some very substantial efforts around building healthy community coalitions in which they and then the associated state health departments are very specifically using a term that you maybe have heard called PS&E, or Policy, Systems, and Environmental Approaches to Physical Activity. And that's really a big deal. That's kind of a new approach, the notion that we think about the policies and systems and environments that affect health behaviors rather than just individuals. And that's at the heart of this premise of healthy community design, right? We're asserting that something beyond just individual motivation might convince the woman in this photo here, and Ben, you are seeing the photo now, right? That screen is up? I'm assuming
yes,
that it
are.
is.
Yep.
Nobody's saying it's not.
We can see it just fine.
Okay, cool. So this woman who decided to ride her kids to school, she's in a lineup of vehicles at this school, but there she is riding up on a bike with the Burley, and the kid hops out, and, you know, it's sort of my dream picture of the drop-off line in an elementary school in America, as opposed to one that we all see, which is, of course, dozens, maybe scores, maybe hundreds of cars there. The question is that all about her individual motivation, or is there something else going on there? So at the heart of it, I would like to share with the group, my goal today is to share sort of how I'm making the case to health officials, health agencies, local, regional, state, national even, how they have to get in the game, and how they have to be building partnerships with planning and transportation officials, agencies, organizations, professionals in the private sector, that if they don't make those relationships and aren't really, really aggressively seeking that, none of the stuff that they hope for is going to happen from the health side. Having said that, I'd also like to equip you for what I think is the typical pushback. So generally, when we make this case, I had this just happen. I was doing workshops out in Iowa. We had a dinner meeting with a bunch of mayors around the Des Moines area, and one guy was kind of pushing back. And here are the four things I tend to hear. The four things that I tend to hear. So what I'd like to do then is respond to each of these with an evidence-based argument and sort of how I think we're going to have to move forward. The picture on the bottom, by the way, here is the more typical drop-off line, not the woman on the bicycle, but rather what we see at many, many elementary schools in America. So here's what happens. You say we can build a healthier community by design. The first thing people tend to say is, well, really, public health, health behavior is a matter of personal decisions and habits. You either choose to eat well, exercise more, or you don't. And if you don't, well, it's your own dang fault. Second, let's say I can convince you of that. Let's say, no, there's evidence that there are other environmental influences and that they're very strong, and even people with good intent can't necessarily be effective. And then they'll say, well, okay, can you show me evidence that if we build it, they will come, that you can create places that would encourage these healthier behaviors? And I'm going to say, yes, we can. Pretty strong basic argument there. To which I now get this argument. Well, if it's such a good idea, why isn't the marketplace taking us there? In other words, if these health benefits are so certain, we're a capitalist society, why isn't the market taking us there? Which I would submit to you, it is. We're getting strong signals from the marketplace, from the free market, that is exactly a desirable outcome. To which then the last thing they might well say, if they're a health official, they'll say, well, what do you want me to do about it? I'm in the health department. I don't do the zoning ordinance. I don't permit subdivisions. How is this my job? Electeds may say, look, there's an entire machinery that does that process, and it's not me as the local city council member. And I think that's malarkey. I think anybody who sort of washes their hands of responsibility, if you're a public official, if you're a professional planner, engineer, developer, private sector, real estate, lender, all have a responsibility to be part of this. Here's how I start the conversation. So what I'm going to do is take you through my rebuttal, or my answer to these four rebuttals. And the first one is this notion of personal responsibility. And I start by talking about kids. And I ask people to think back to their own youth. And I think about your earliest recollections of being physically active. And they will. And we sometimes have conversations. We do exercises. But the bottom line is people remember being what I like to call free-range kids. Lots of us at a certain age remember being allowed to play freely, walking and bicycling to school, playing at a neighborhood park, pickup games, not all organized structural physical activity. And the problem is there's been a really dramatic change over just a few decades. And I think one illustration of that is how kids get to school. If you look at this data on trips to school, just in about a 30-year time period, you saw the percentage of kids walking and bicycling to school plummet from about 40% to only about 15%, whereas the percentage being driven to school by car went from about 15% to almost half. Now, this is national data, but it's when we do, for example, community-level safe routes to school workshops, I see this replicated again and again and again. Urban settings, suburban settings, rural settings. as many as half of kids are being dropped off by car, picked up by car. Very common figure. 40 to 50% is really, really normal. And that's a 3-decade change, this dramatic reversal, right? And interestingly, and I believe not at all coincidentally, the other interesting thing that happened over that same 3 decades is that childhood obesity rates tripled. So we're talking about 3 decades where we got in the habit of putting kids in the back seat of the car for every trip. We do this to them. And of course, when we ask people, why do you insist, even if your kid's going to be physically active, going to a ball field, going to dance class, whatever, you're driving them, or why can't you just let them walk to school anymore? Why can't you let them be free range like many of us where they say it's a different time? And of course, we would all acknowledge socio-demographics have changed. There are more households where both parents work. There are more single-parent households. So there are lots of dynamics that are very, very, very different now. Many would argue, well, because of that, that means our neighborhood streets are not as well observed by an at-home parent during the day. That said, many would also say that this pendulum has swung too far the other way, because if you actually look at evidence about, for example, childhood abductions by an unknown assailant, they're no worse now than they were 30 or 40 years ago. Certainly there are more custodial arguments, so we do, the rate of reporting is much higher. But you see the vast, vast majority of reports of a missing child is an estranged parent or grandparent in the midst of a custodial battle. The reason I'm saying that is because we're starting to hear some pushback on this, as you're probably well aware. This Time magazine cover represents a discussion on the topic of overparenting, and the reality that American parents have been marinated in fear, not letting their kids be free range. Recently, there was a really big story that got a lot of coverage on the internet, at least. The couple down in Bethesda, Maryland, that let their kids walk to a park a half-mile away. Kids were actually picked up, 10 and 6 years old, I think they were picked up by local police. Social services got involved. What many people have not heard is that most recently, their equivalent of the Department of Social Services has come out with a statement that says that we were probably out of hand here, that indeed we are supposed to let parents raise kids their own way. And if these parents felt it was safe and had taught these kids how to walk there, we acknowledge that that's their privilege to do it. This is a parent's decision, unless these kids were at some risk. And the only reason I'm mentioning that is because this is a hot topic right now. My students at the university are, really intrigued by this stuff. Because my point is this: at the heart of it, we're talking about an issue that certainly there are places kids shouldn't walk unaccompanied, ride a bicycle because the road is too wide, the traffic is too fast, the volume is too great. But if you really want to think about what we shouldn't be nervous about for our kids, it is this reality, this special issue of Time magazine, in which they looked at a disease that as recently as 25 years ago we called adult onset diabetes. That was actually used in a clinical setting, adult onset diabetes. Can't use that term anymore because we now see this, which is now called type 2 diabetes, that's the actual clinical term for it, in 8- and 9-year-old kids, like the young lady pictured here. We now have elementary school nurses who have to be trained to take blood glucose measurements because they might well be administering a diabetes medication to a kid that we literally thought 20 years ago physiologically couldn't get this disease. And the important point about that is we can talk about change in genetics. We can talk about research into the drugs. Well, our genes haven't changed in 30 years, that's for sure. It's not like we're more genetically predisposed to it. It's two things. There are two risk factors, behavioral risk factors, that are driving this epidemic of chronic disease, and it is physical inactivity and poor nutrition. Those two behaviors are driving up rates not only of type 2 diabetes, but cardiovascular disease risk, osteoporosis, a host of afflictions associated with sedentary lifestyle. And the reason I say that is because I would submit that one of our jobs, when we start to talk about this stuff, when we talk about the health benefits of planning, for example, why are you even in this conversation? People go to the obesity epidemic, and then they immediately go to nutrition. So they want to talk about the obesity epidemic. That's the thing that gets all the press. And then they say, and clearly it's about what people eat. And that is only, at most, half of the story. And admittedly, I would argue, we, even in planning, have a role around nutrition. We can think about everything from zoning neighborhood stores and community gardens and conserving agricultural land, so the shortening the farm to table distance. That's an entirely different conversation. Let's just talk about the physical activity side of the equation. There's a huge opportunity here, so we need to make this connection and say these are the big epidemics we face as a nation. You want to talk about what's driving up health care costs in this country: 3 behavioral risk factors: tobacco use, physical inactivity, poor nutrition. And I would argue in all 3 of those arenas, we who work in planning can have an opportunity to have an influence, whether it's smoke-free 24-hour, 24/7 smoke-free policies in public parks and in multifamily housing, to as I said, zoning for local stores, to all the things we can do around physical activity. So I'm going to tell the physical activity story, the data, in just 3 numbers, because I could do reams of evidence around how physically inactive we are, but I'm going to just tell you 30, 20, and 365. 30 is the minutes per day the guidelines tell us we should all be physically active. Surgeon General's report said this back in 1996. In 2008, they published a National Physical Activity Guidelines. This summer, 2015, a Surgeon General's call to action on walking and walkability is going to come out. Keep your antenna up for this. Surgeon General's call to action on walking and walkability, I suspect it'll be in the next 2 months. And the reason I mention this is because it could reinvigorate this discussion about the health benefits of more walkable communities. It should very explicitly do so. So we know 30 minutes a day is a recommendation for adults. It's a minimum. We should get more, but that's at least what we should get. Kids should at least get an hour of physical activity a day. We know that it can be broken up. It does not have to be structured. Go change your clothes, go to the gym, take a shower, exercise. It could be walking to and from school, walking to the bus, walking to work on a daily basis. That's the good news. That seems like a very attainable goal. The bad news is that fewer than 20% of Americans actually meet these recommendations through what we call leisure time physical activity, consciously going to the gym, taking a class, training for a marathon. Fewer than 1 in 5. 365, sadly not days of the year, it's 365,000 premature deaths annually estimated due to the diseases associated with sedentary living and poor nutrition, the big 2 of the big 3. And the third, tobacco, by the way, kills something like more like 450,000 in part because there's a second-hand effect. So although this 30-minute goal sounds attainable, here's the graph showing the data that the Centers for Disease Control collects on the percentage of Americans meeting that guideline of roughly 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week. And sadly, 2 things about it. 1, the 20% is an overestimate because it's based on self-report data. When they objectively measure it, when they put an accelerometer or a pedometer on somebody's hip and actually measure physical activity, you get numbers closer to 5% of adults and 10% of kids actually meeting the guidelines. Let me say it again. 1 in 20 adults, 1 in 10 kids meeting the guidelines. And secondarily, you look at the graph, it's dead flat. So whatever we've been doing has been ineffective, telling them to exercise. And my last little bit of public health is just a graphic that shows exercise minutes per week in an exercise intervention study. The vertical axis is exercise minutes per week over a 18-month period, a year and a half, of which the first 6 months they actually did an intervention in which they called people on the phone and sent them email reminders. They set up walking groups. They taught them how to stretch before and how to, warm up before and how to stretch after their walks. They told them how to select good walking shoes. And they gave them prizes. We love doing that in health promotion. Maybe you've seen this in Bike to Work Week, right? We love to give T-shirts and water bottles and little blinky lights and fanny packs. And it works. Over the 6-month intervention period, you'll notice the 3 groups in the study increase their exercise minutes per week. By the way, these 3 groups represent one group being told walk your 40 minutes all at once. One group was told you can break it into 3 10-minute walks, long bouts, short bouts. And then the third group, they not only said you could break it into 4 10-minute walks, they put a treadmill in their house. So these people could go jump on the treadmill for the 10-minute bouts of walking. And so all the stuff they did encouraged them to walk for the 6 months that they were in the intervention trial. But then they left them to their own devices. And although they measured statistically significant increases in aerobic fitness and decreases in weight, so again, they were losing weight, they were getting more fit, just walking 30 to 40 minutes a day. After they were left to their own devices, you'll notice that all 3 groups, the behavior dropped off. They actually dropped off. Some people ask, Mark, it looks like they're actually worse off at the end than when they started, and that's probably because they came into this study, they signed up for this trial with intent, or maybe their daughter's wedding was coming up, or their high school reunion. But then life gets in the way, and I would argue, more importantly, the world gets in the way. They still live in the same physical environment where sidewalks don't connect, where they've got to cross streets with huge volumes of traffic, where none of their destinations are nearby because of our modern land use patterns. In other words, we didn't change the world, we tried to change their behavior. And we did that by focusing only on the tippy top of this pyramid. So a little behavioral psychology here. The people that work in behavior change talk about socio-ecological approaches to behavior change. And they say, you can't just focus on the individual at the top of the pyramid. Sure, tell me to exercise well, teach me how to warm up, tell me to stretch afterwards, all good. But that's not enough. I've got to have the other influences in my life, from family and friends to the institutions that matter to me, whether it's my school, my workplace, my healthcare provider, to the community by its physical design, and indeed by policy. That all of those have to direct me in the same direction. And I make this a pyramid because I believe Things like community design and public policy are foundational. If those foundations aren't there, I can do a great job with the behavior change at the top. It's never going to stick. Indeed, that graphic that I showed a moment ago, I called that the stickiness problem, because although I can get that increase in exercise minutes per week in the beginning, it doesn't stick. It dropped off afterwards because we didn't change any of the foundational stuff. They still lived in the same community they lived in before. And we have plenty of examples in public health of this, of having done this, right? This is not like this is, some people sort of balk. They go, sounds to me like the nanny state, Fenton. You're going to tell me I got to eat my broccoli. Well, on the contrary, we've seen that this is very effective when there's enough public health need. And that includes, for example, our successes around tobacco, right? We don't just say don't smoke, it's bad for you. We've taxed the daylights out of the product. We don't advertise it on television anymore. We've made it hard to smoke in public places. We've enforced the bans on the sales to minors. In other words, we've made a rule which is sticky for not smoking. Now, you can still smoke. It's legal and everything else, but you're going to do it at home. You're going to do it on your own terms, and you're going to pay the price. There's a social cost to smoking, which is the almost inevitable likelihood you're going to be sick, and we're all going to collectively pay for it, and you're going to die prematurely. So you pay for that in the tax on the cigarettes, right? That's built in. But we've done it with things like child safety restraints. We've done it around our waste stream, right, with recycling. I would argue one of the great successes of public health, in which the planning and engineering professions were instrumental, was, of course, the fact that we don't see waterborne illness in the United States. There's this horrible cholera outbreak going on down in Haiti still now, because they have no modern sanitation system. Meanwhile, as I've sat on my local planning board, I see the exhaustive amount of time we spend looking at the stormwater requirements, making sure the sewer hookups are appropriate, the clean water system, making sure that no pipes cross, right, all of that. It's just built into ordinance. And if a developer came to me and said, came to our board and said, hey, we're coming out of the recession, we want to get the economy going again, get this new 14-house subdivision in. We're in a little town, that would be a big deal. But he says, we're going to go with open pit toilets behind the houses to keep the costs down. We'd say, no, thank you. You're not going to build that here. Same developer comes in and says, hey, we're going to try to get the economy going again, 14-house subdivision, want to save a few bucks to get it going again. We'd like a waiver on the sidewalk requirement. Boggles my mind how many times across the country I have seen planning, often boards more so than staff, say, yes, that's okay, fine, just get the thing built. We got to stop doing that, because not everybody's going to go to the gym. That's just not going to do it. We know that the order of magnitude of Americans that will take on volitional exercise is something like 5 to 10%. So if you accept my argument that there is this public health epidemic and that physical activity is a piece of it, you also got to accept the argument that we're going to have to begin to do things like being physically active as a part of daily life easier. And walking and bicycling and transit are three of the easiest ways to do that, if we can just build it in routinely. It's not the only ways, but they are population level. They're at the base of the pyramid type interventions, to which you should be asking, okay, I'm accepting the argument that there's some environmental influence, but is there any reason to believe that if we build it, they will come, that we can create places that will actually alter behavior or encourage this altered behavior, or at least be stickier for this altered behavior? So if our health partners do a good program, like the one in the graphic before, it sticks. Short answer is yes, there is. Pretty good body of research. Some of it comes from planning, some of it comes from transportation. If you go to TRB, Transportation Research Board, you'll see these kinds of articles now. Lots of it comes from public health. So journals like the American Journal of Health Promotion, the American Journal of Public Health, Journal of Preventive Medicine, which maybe none of you read, but let me tell you, there's a really good body of literature in there, often co-authored by health, planning, transportation officials, sometimes economic development. Here are the 4 things that I see in that literature. In other words, the 4 threads that seem to come up again and again, and none of this will sound surprising. Any of you who've worked in planning for any duration, this is in our conferences, it happens that we talk about it at our planning conferences, you see it in the journals. A variety of destinations within walk, bike, and transit distance, mixed land use, right, mixed and generally more dense. 2, good connections between those land uses. You need connected networks, sidewalks, bike lanes, trails, multi-use facilities. 3, when you get to a destination, it is rewarding rather than punishing for having shown up without a car. And 4, all of what you've done here is safe and accessible for all ages, abilities, and incomes. Now, this is important. All 4 of these, to my reading, have to be in place if you really want to see this shift in physical activity or transportation behavior. The reason I say that is because it's very easy for people to say, well, we're going to pass a complete streets bill, get the sidewalks in, or put in the bike lanes, we're all done. Well, not if the land uses aren't there, not if stuff's not close enough together. And even if you do both of those, that's not enough if when I get there, I'm still faced with a giant parking lot before I get to the front door and nowhere to park my bike. In other words, it is on the macro scale, land use, the medium scale, the corridors, and the micro scale site design, all three have to be in concert with an eye toward this type of design. And this I feel very strongly, and I think you see it in the research literature, because you can't peel these things apart very well in the research, but I think because they're very hard to. You know, how do you do a study of, okay, sidewalk here, not sidewalk there, but both have crummy land use or both have really good land use, right? Those are very hard things to parse apart. Having said that, you know, I'm not telling you anything I'm sure most people on this call don't know. I'm sure you're all, you know, sort of getting the notion that with regard to land use, people are talking about having live, work, shop, play, learn, play in proximity versus not. I often point out when I'm working in smaller communities, you know, people will say, well, this sounds like urban. This sounds like, you know, New York City or Minneapolis or Portland or, you know, but not small town America. I would argue it is the very fabric of the small town America, right? There was a main street with mixed use retail on the first floor, housing above, schools, post office, city hall were right there. There was often a community green, a common green space that was shared, neighborhood schools, smaller parcel homes, right, often backloaded, so garages out back on alleyways were not uncommon. So you have these beautiful, what I call big wheel sidewalks, which is a sidewalk the kid can ride his big wheel on because it's not crossed by a driveway every 50 feet because the garages face out back. You know, that's a very common urban or even city or small town form, right, that we saw across America. Next is the network of facilities. Sidewalks, multi-use pathways and trails, on-street facilities like bicycle lanes, shared use arrows, and transit. I'll point out that there's a growing body of research, a number of studies now that connect routine transit use with meeting the physical activity guidelines. Notably, lower income folks tend to benefit from this, not surprising. They tend also to be more transit users. And even when you control for inclination to exercise, so go to a city like a Boulder, Colorado, where there are a lot of people that ride bikes and go climbing and, you know, do all these physical activities. Even when you control for whether you are not a conscious exerciser or not, you see this benefit to transit riders. So in other words, transit riders aren't necessarily all exercise geeks. That's not the reason. I also need to point out that when we're talking to health folks, or I find even just local agencies often, they immediately hear this and they say, oh, so you're the guy who says we got to stripe a bike lane everywhere. And I say, contrary. We know there are lots of different tools for creating a bicycle network, for example, from shared use arrows. Just, in fact, for no treatment at all on street in quiet neighborhoods. Bicyclists should just be riding on street like vehicles, but you can use shared use arrows, you can use bicycle lanes, in this case a nice colored lane from Columbus, Ohio with an advanced bicycle box, which is a really cool treatment there. To protected bike lanes or buffered bike lanes, these are now coming into fashion in the U.S. We saw them over in Europe. We've now seen them being put on the ground in the U.S. and the world has not come to an end. Actually, it seems to be working. To separated facilities, and I often use this picture from the American River Trail out in Sacramento, in no small part because this was a harder portion to complete. It was the portion in closest to the downtown, the last few miles, hard right-of-way. Part of it, they're practically underneath the elevated expressway. I also say it's one of the most important sections of the trail because it is well-suited to everyday use, not just a recreational ride out to Folsom Reservoir, you know, scores of miles outside the city, but rather this is the section you can ride every day to work, down to the Old Town District. You know, that guy's got his pannier on the bike there, and he's one less car up on that expressway. He's one less car we have to park down. His greenhouse gas footprint is lower, and indeed, yes, I, as his employer, am likely to pay less in health care because he's not going to have a heart attack, or he's statistically less likely to. So it's a big win all the way around. By the way, that's my argument to the local official who says, you know, I would never walk on a trail that's underneath an elevated expressway. I say, shut up. I don't care whether you'll ever walk on it or ride your bike on it. If this guy does, you benefit because you're not competing with his car. He's not polluting your environment, and he's lowering your health care costs because he's not going to have a heart attack. And I mean that, actually. I think we as a field, people who think about this stuff have to be less apologetic, less begging for this stuff, and more insistent that the benefits are so collective. That whether you as an individual don't anticipate using it is immaterial because we have enough evidence that others will. Third, when I get to my destination, does it reward me or punish me, right? So I think this is really important because we often forget this piece, right? We say, well, we've got mixed land use, there's retail fairly near residential, and there's a sidewalk that gets you over there, but if the sidewalk ends out in front of this parking lot and I still got to play Frogger to get to the front door, you can be certain that my 70-year-old mom's not going to make that final leg of the journey on foot. Or somebody in a wheelchair is going to be challenged to do so. Or I'm going to be hesitant to let my 9-year-old or 10-year-old do that, right? Versus the picture on the lower left, right? And you know, not everything can look precisely like downtown. I think in this case Kalamazoo, I'm not sure, Yeah, it is. But I'm telling you that there are lessons from having the building up at the street and street trees and street furnishings and benches and awnings that are more than aesthetics. And in fact, I have frequently encouraged communities not to use the term amenities when talking about some of the features that we're talking about here, like trees and benches and lighting, bicycle parking. I love that bike parking at Michigan Tech, by the way, that's underneath cover. So even in the wintry weather up there, we saw kids riding bikes because they had dry bike parking. So nice Walgreens. I take pictures of Walgreens all over the United States. They're ubiquitous. Maybe some of you have heard me tell this story. There's that building's up at the street. You can see benches there that serve a corner transit stop. The parking area is visually screened there by that fencing and street trees, bike rack. And I will get pushback, of course, when I'm out in the heartland, and they'll say, you know, but everybody knows Portland is a communist enclave, and they can do that stuff. You know, they can get away with that. There's a much more standard Walgreens template, and I know this because having served on a local planning board, we've seen these kinds of applications. The pharmacy is going to want the corner parcel. They're going to want to be set back with the parking out front. They're going to want the drive-through out back. That's their standard, and if you push back on them, maybe you'll get some landscaping and things like that. But this is a standard formula, even with the blank walls facing the road and everything else. And what's notable is that everybody assumes that's the standard, and if you say no to them, you're not going to get their business, right? The developer's going to walk. And I'm sure some of you on staff have heard that if you recommended those kinds of changes, let's require a bike rack even, just something simple. If they'll say, look, we can't push too hard on this developer, they'll take their application and walk. So that's what, you know, Neenah, Wisconsin, that's what they did. They get the standard Walgreens, right, and get the parking lot out front. And no real pedestrian or bicycle accommodation, and not a communist enclave, admittedly, right? It's not Portland, but Appleton, Wisconsin, which I've gotten the sense is not a communist enclave. They've got this Walgreens on their main drag, and you know, to get this, obviously the first step is have it in your ordinance, have a build to, not a setback line, have maybe change the parking requirements, acknowledge, give credit for municipal parking that's in the district rather than having a big parking footprint next to it. Go a step further, have an overlay district that allows them to put a second story with some apartments. Let the developer make some money on this thing because you're going to ask for street trees, you know, facilities like pedestrian scale lighting, a bike rack. Not daunting costs, but sure, make up some of that cost. And I can't say this strongly enough, and this is one of my very strong messages to the health folks. You can be the vocal support so that if you have elected officials or a board like a planning commission or especially staff who's willing to do this stuff, you got to be there for them in the public hearing. You got to show up and say, I'm there, we support this, and there are community health benefits to this. This is not just sort of nice aesthetic design. This makes this destination more functional for a pedestrian or bicyclist to not have to make their way across a parking lot, to have an obvious and safe bicycle rack. These things all matter. So those are three of the things, and then the fourth, which is really three of the elements that the sort of answer the if we build it, will they come in question. And the fourth is that it's still got to be safe and accessible for everybody, all ages, incomes, and abilities. And here's where I'm going to defend my discipline a little bit, the engineering discipline, because I will say that I think over the recent decade we've had some really good innovative work in how to design places where pedestrians, bicyclists, transit, motor vehicles can coexist. I'm sure everybody on the line, many people know more about this than I do, but I really try to pay attention to the evolving movement here. So median islands, mid-block crossing islands, picture in the top left, roundabouts, which were just anathema, right? We can't, roundabouts, they're European, they'll never work here, and we're seeing them going in instead of signalized intersections all over the country. We're seeing a growing body of data showing reduced collisions, maintaining throughput, reduced severity of collisions. It's interesting because the study I'm quoting here on the bottom, back in about 2000, a little before, the California Department of Health asked the question, do we run the risk that inviting more people to walk and bike will indeed lower cardiovascular risk, but more of them will get run over by cars so that we won't get the public health benefit? And that's how public health people think. You know, they're always doing cost and benefits, and it's a reasonable question. And of course, with Pete Jacobson's study, Injury Prevention, and others, by John Pooker's done some cool work on this, others have, that says as you tend to put more bikes and pedestrians out on the road, you tend to see rates of injury and fatality go down. And, you know, I've asked them about it, and they both tended to suggest the causality arrow may go in both directions, in as much as the things you do to put more bicyclists and pedestrians out there, improved crossings, roundabouts, you know, curb extensions like the picture on the lower right, make it safer, right? That pedestrian's more visible, they've got a shorter crossing distance, vehicles that are turning more slowly. The other side of that coin is as we put more bikes and pedestrians out there, cars expect to see them. They may themselves occasionally be a bicyclist or a pedestrian, so they're more sensitized when they're driving. So you get this net effect, and I think it's an important answer to the Department of Health's question. An example, we've talked a lot about these all over the country. We're seeing them happen, lane reductions, or sometimes they're frequently being called road diets, a 4-to-3 reduction, in this case from Urbana, Illinois. Jennifer Selby was the engineer on this. Got some pushback. Some of the businesses along this corridor said, you're going to kill us because you're going to reduce the capacity of drivers to get to us. Of course, not acknowledging that right now drivers have to make, on the left picture there, had to make a horrible left turn across 2 lanes of oncoming traffic facing a multiple threat. In so doing, they force traffic to go around them, delaying the right lanes, and that you eliminate those very collisions and problems when you go to the 3-lane alignment, maintain the flow, fewer collisions, and voila, room for a bicycle lane in each direction and center median islands for pedestrian crossing in sections where you don't need the turn movement. My point is we're seeing these all over the country, and some are as elaborate as this, but I'm delighted to tell you, in as much as I'm making the case this is the kind of stuff that can be done anywhere. I was in Hutchinson, Kansas a couple of years ago, and this East Avenue A sort of separated a lower income neighborhood on the left from more the downtown district to the right here, and they were getting the word that folks were hesitant to let their kids cross to get to school, to the Boys and Girls Club, whatever it was that was across the street, because this thing felt so much like a highway. And I just sort of jimmied up these images in a PowerPoint slide and said, you know, this is what a lane reduction could look like on this road. Might be something for your engineers just to study. It looks like the volumes. I'm standing out there in the middle of the lane there at 4 in the afternoon. It definitely had overcapacity, and it was kind of chunked, as you can imagine, right? It kind of was platooned. So I said, you know, something to consider. And to their great credit, they did actually analyze it. That road was up for repaving anyway. So this is the change. They actually gave it the road diet that next summer during the construction season when they were going to be paving anyway. They said, look, from a cost standpoint, almost no difference. Because it's not a heavily signalized, so we don't have to make a lot of changes other than where we paint the lines. And they've said residents have felt it feels like a different road, you know, because the driver behavior is different. They feel a little more comfortable letting kids cross and ride along it on the bike lanes. My point is Hutchinson, Kansas, this is not a big, wealthy city that's got a lot of money to throw at these projects. We're finding there are more and more of these kinds of things that we can do with modest dough. So having said that, those 4 elements, many people will say, one of the secondary sort of rebuttals to the if we build it, will they come? They'll say, okay, fine, I'm buying the argument that you can build these places, that they actually are different for bicycle and pedestrian behavior, that those are the elements that would increase routine walking, cycling, transit use. They're fine for cities. What about rural areas? My answer is rural and suburban edge America is precisely the most important place to be thinking about this stuff. As our rural population has dropped, this is from Robert Putnam's book, a book called Bowling Alone, which talks about shifts in social capital. It's really a great book if you haven't looked at it. But he talks about this dramatic drop in our rural population not being replaced by urban population, but largely by a suburban population, and in part because of the sort of oozing outward of suburbia into our formerly rural lands. It's not a conscious decision. I'm quite convinced people didn't consciously say, I want to move to a place where every trip has to be by car. Ooh, I love suburbia. I think what they did was they said, I got to work and drive out to where, I got to go to where land is affordable, where I can afford a house, or where the schools are better, or whatever other perceived benefits. So, you know, they moved to rural America for their piece of the pie, picture on the top here. But what we see again and again is from the picture on the bottom, this kind of landscape being replaced by this kind of a landscape, kind of classic single-use, segregated-use stuff, single-use housing subdivision, every trip will be by car. So my point is only the rural landscape is perhaps the most important place to get ahead of this and decide what you want it to become. You know, is this the outcome that you want or not? Because to not make a decision is to make one, because we'll default to kind of the standard type of design we've been doing. So to summarize, if the question is, if we build it, can we elicit behavior change? Do we create an environment that is more conducive to the kind of behavior I'm talking about? The short answer is yes. Website at the bottom of this page, activelivingresearch.org. I highly recommend. Maintained by the University of San Diego, UC San Diego, through funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Active Living Research. If you haven't been to it, go. It's got a bibliographic sort of a data set so that if you plug in a topic like trails and physical activity, or you know, sort of school location and walkability, you'll get any recent papers on that topic. And they do a lot of white papers that are sort of summaries of the recent research in the field. Really high quality. But essentially, read that research, and I still think you'd agree with me. These are the big 4. These are the 4 elements that tend to create greater routine walking and bicycling behavior, transit use.
Hey, Mark, we have
okay, great, Mark. Maybe I buy that argument. If it's such a good idea, shouldn't the free market take us there? Shouldn't the marketplace we're a capitalist society, and here's where I think we should be unabashed in making this argument, and we need to equip ourselves particularly, not so much for the health people now, but for the elected and appointed officials that are going to have to say yes to this stuff, because they're the ones that are going to say, look, I like your 30 minutes a day idea, but I care about revitalizing downtown. I care about maintaining the value of our housing stock in our community. So the kinds of studies that I turn to are like these. This is one called Walking the Walk, How Walkability Raising Housing Values in the U.S. Cities. And it was done by a group called CEOs for Cities, a nonprofit business organization. Maybe you've seen this before. If you haven't, it's worth a quick look. But the bottom line was, anytime I'm in a community, I'll look at one of their more suburban neighborhoods, get walk scores there, look at their more walkable neighborhoods, connected to schools, parks, playgrounds, where you get a higher walk score. And if, by the way, you're not familiar with walk score, note that it's an imperfect instrument at best. It only accounts for a mix of land uses. It doesn't account for sidewalk quality, so the network, it doesn't talk about site design, is the building up at the street or not, right? But it does look at land use, and just based on that, they saw statistically significant differences in home value between places that were higher versus lower walk score, and that's notable. And by the way, you've got to compare comparable homes, right? You've got to compare a 2,000 square foot home. You can't compare a 4,500 square foot McMansion to a 1,500 square foot bungalow. But when you match homes for size and attributes, bedrooms, bathrooms, things like that, what you find is higher walk score, higher home value. Other studies have suggested less time on the market, and studies that looked at the recent foreclosure boom said those places with higher walk scores or better transit service also lower foreclosure rates. This publication, which I really love, it comes out, I think, twice a year, National Association of Realtors, called On Common Ground, does an annual survey, the NAR does, asking, what are home buyers looking for? And so in 2010, they asked, what's the next generation? Let's do a decadal look. What's coming for the decade? And it was these kinds of trends, right? People have a taste for in-town living, public transportation, they're thinking more green. It does not mean everybody wants to be a Lycra wearing. It was really interesting, because if you read the articles, it doesn't say everybody wants to be a Lycra wearing, ride their bike 20 miles to work, bike nut. But it means they want to be able to hop on their bike and ride to a corner store, a coffee shop, a park, a playground, walk their kids to school. The very fundamental things kind of represented by this sort of an image, right? And I tell people, this is not the Sierra Club. It looks like a publication of them. It's the National Association of Realtors. I urge you to take a look at the EPA's Smart Growth website, because they have done a great job of compiling these sort of white paper sort of reports, synthesizing the research. These are just two of them. Smart Growth and Economic Success is the series. The one on the left is benefits for real estate developers, investors, businesses, and local governments. The one on the right talks about the business case. There's another one on infill development. So there are a number of these, now I think up to 5, that talk about what's the economic case for these kinds of development, right? Using what I would call healthy community design prescription: mixed use, connected network, good site design, safety and access for all, those 4 elements. Now notable, the one on the left, for example, says developers are increasingly interested in this stuff because more compact development means less utilities in the ground, means more potential gain per square foot developed. So they're interested, they also acknowledge that the market is looking for this kind of development. They want to redevelop in urban cores that already have infrastructure. Why be putting new water pipes in the ground if I can redevelop an area that's already got them? On the right, this one looked more at what happens after we build or redevelop this stuff, and it says more revenue per square foot, tax dollars, retail. And again, this is important. We can't let people say you're still just talking about the big cities, New York, Portland, LA, whatever, because small-town America manifests these same challenges. In fact, I think some of the greatest opportunity are in the dead main streets of small and medium-sized towns across the country that would benefit from this kind of redevelopment. Having said that, yes, I'll acknowledge that there's a great study from New York City's Department of Transportation, the great metropolis, that looked at their pre- and post-project retail revenue on streets that were getting all those really cool pedestrian, bike, and transit projects during Jeanette Sedek-Kahn's tenure there, under the Bloomberg mayoral administration. And what's notable is, again, measured statistically significant boosts in retail and therefore tax revenue in those areas that got the very improvements that were so controversial at the time, taking away lanes and restriping and creating these protected bike corridors and so on. A little more broad would be this study done by the Bike Walk Alliance, the Alliance for Bicycling and Walking, that's their website, or the Green Lane Project done jointly, that looked at specifically communities that have put in some type of protected bike facility. So either separate protected bike lanes or multi-use trails that are off traffic. And it's notable that these invite a certain type of bicyclist that might not ride on an on-street facility without protection. And what they're seeing trends across the communities that have done these, again, real estate values, but also businesses wanting to locate there because they're saying, look, millennials, this is a double-edged thing. There are two population groups interested in these kinds of communities. The empty nest baby boomers, who don't want a big yard, don't need the large lot anymore, would like to be able to walk to a coffee shop, and the millennials who often don't have a driver's license or cars. And if you're a new business or a growing business that wants to recruit and retain skilled employees, you want more productive workers that are healthier, you want to be in a city where they're more likely to ride a bike, to walk. I just think it's striking that we're making these kinds of economic connections. But perhaps most telling is this issue of the National Association of Home Builders magazine, creatively titled Builder. And this magazine comes out monthly. And this issue, March of last year, the cover story was walkability, why we care, and why you should too. And if you haven't seen it, it's available at their website. Go to their website, Home Builder Magazine, National Association of Home Builders. They do 6 little case studies of communities from very rural to very urban with walking-oriented projects. But essentially they're saying, look, I as a home builder know this is what sells. So I'm responding to consumer desire. It gives me flexibility in design. I don't just have to go with the 4,500 square foot McMansion on an acre. My development costs can be lower when I do more compact mixed development. And in one of the studies that I've read, they've actually used the term walkability premium. We can charge a walkability premium, meaning they're higher valued, right? Now, this opens the door, and we could have another conversation at another time about gentrification and some of those issues, because what happens is we make a neighborhood walkable enough, it's desirable, the market value goes up. So the good news is that means you're acknowledging my point that it's desirable. The bad news is that could push out the very people who lived there originally, to which I say there are tools in our toolkit, as you guys know, inclusionary zoning, accessory dwellings, affordable accessory dwellings, required mix of housing type and size. There are tools that we can use there to help deal with that, and I believe we should as a piece of this conversation, because I'm certain of the success. Last piece, regarding retail development, I am delighted to see a trend for communities of all sorts of sizes reevaluate whether they want their ordinances to require, let alone even allow, the type of development that we see on the right here. Right, standard sort of big box retail design, strip development, whatever you want to call it. And we also see people creatively redeveloping these. I would call these healthier redesigns. So in the lower left, Winter Park, that's called Winter Park Village, former big box complex, struggling, got to that 40% vacancy rate. All the boxes were sort of not full. A couple of anchors hung in there. So they rewrote the zoning, the overlay, created a special district such that you could tear up half of the park and create facing sets of buildings that were multi-story with retail on the first floor, apartments, condos, offices above. And the thing is dramatically more successful because not in no small part because we're now placing potential customers right there in the mixed use, right? So mixed use redevelopment of these kinds of parcels is not an earth-shattering idea. I'm sure most of you have heard it before. Maybe you've got your own example in your community, your region of this. I'm just struck to see that in this Winter Park when there were apartments over a my gosh, it was a cheesecake factory. And I remember coming home from the visit, doing the workshops down there. I said, get a load of this, man. This one development we saw, there's apartments over a cheesecake factory. Who would want to live above the cheesecake factory? And my wife goes, me? I would live above the cheesecake factory. And then she said, and if there was a brew pub, you would live above it too. You would be right next door. And I said, yeah, you're right. So interesting what's happening. I think the last telling example when we were at the Michigan workshop, I had done stuff up in Houghton on their website. If you look at websites across America of cities, towns, they have these kinds of pictures. Happy people on their main street and riding on their really cool bike trail and down at their waterfront. This next one is not the photo they put on their website. You don't see the giant multi-lane arterial state route coming into town by the big box complex. That is not the picture they feature on their website. So we can argue about sort of what the economics is or whether they've been, but clearly people know what's desirable, right? If this is not what they're marketing, right? Maybe we should think about whether we want to design it this way in the first place. So that leads us to this question about well, this is not really my job. How do you expect me to do this if I'm not even given the authority, the responsibility? What we're finding is engaging people at the very practical level. It's a top-down, bottom-up thing. The top-down piece is getting elected and appointed boards and staff to get this, to understand the technical details, right, and the economic argument. And then from the bottom up, getting the community to support it, because, still this 4-to-3 lane conversion is counterintuitive. You're going to take away lanes. How can that work? So we get them out, do walk audits, do community education, ask them about what their desires are. And we don't say, how many lanes do you want on the road? We say, what do you want? And they say, well, we want to be able to walk along the street and cross from the stores on this side to that side. Then we can say, well, funny enough, there's evidence that shows we've done these across the country. These 4-to-3 conversions will give us that. So having said that, I'm going to challenge you with 3 things as we part here. I'm going to ask you to speak up, to act up, and to step up. And speak up is be a voice for this. Make this health to land use, to environment, to transportation system connection every chance you get. Don't talk just about an obesity epidemic. Talk about epidemics of physical inactivity and poor nutrition and how better planning and design can get us better outcomes. Then I want you to actually help change the environment, and that means at the policy level. And I'm going to challenge you on the final point to help elicit this change in your own life. In other words, behave this way, because you're going to understand it so much better if you try it. So here's one of the challenges we face on that first one. Speak up, creating coalitions and so on, getting people talking about this. Public health folks tend to want to create coalitions, and they want everybody in it. So this is the list, and if I do a graphic of it, this is an example. And my point in showing you all these bubbles is the health folks would tend to want everybody at the table. They want to, let's get everybody in. So including over on the left there, things like the American Cancer Society and Heart Association and diabetes, big employers in the hospital, health insurance, the YMCA, Parks and Recreation, trails, the elected officials, public works. And that's great, but, in my experience in working with lots of communities, you get very little done. You have this big coalition, you have these coalition meetings, lots of big flip chart papers and colored dots and voting on what our priorities are. The places that are successful are building a model that looks much more like this. They've got a core leadership group team thinking specifically about healthy design. Like this is their action, right? This is what they're focused on. And you'll notice it's mixed. It doesn't, no 2 are the same 10 circles, but it's about 10 people. It's not 20. It's certainly not 50. And it's across disciplines. It includes public and private sector and 3 things to be on the team. In other words, if you were going to compose this team in your community, maybe you've already got one, but do a check and see if the members of your team, which should be only 10, meet these criteria. 1, they embrace this vision of community design that is based on, sort of a healthy, sustainable model. 2, they see it as their job to be working on this. So if I'm the guy in public works, it's because I'm the guy who's striping lanes. So when we start talking about striping bike lanes or doing road diets, I'm the striper. So, or I'm the guy who's responsible for the stripers, so I should be in that conversation. And 3, they're the kind of people who have reach and influence in the community. So when it comes time to reach out to that larger group, because there will be times when you want the whole coalition to be able to show up at an event, or to line up at the microphone at a public hearing and give the planning commission or city council the support to do the gutsy thing, to stand up to the developer that wants to put the Walgreens at the back of the parking lot and say, no, 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 you're bringing it up. That's what we do here. That's what our ordinance requires. We're not giving you a waiver. And it's a lot easier for those electeds if you have the reach and can fill the room with representatives of all the groups to say that. I actually was asked by this journal, Childhood Obesity, a couple of years ago to write a review article that said, what's going to break the back of the obesity epidemic, the childhood obesity epidemic. And, of course, I wish it was called the childhood inactivity and poor nutrition epidemic, because those are the 2 things we have to change. But I said, okay. And they thought I was going to talk a lot about walking programs and, more PE in schools and stuff. But I said, I think it's these 5. And so I just want to share some quick thoughts on sort of how I think these are. And the first of them, you all know this. Our ordinances and subdivision design regulations have to sort of say this is what we want. In other words, we can't be begging for it, fighting an arm wrestling match every time we want it to build to be multi-story and sort of up at the street, bike parking. It should just be built into ordinance. So let's not have our ordinance have 250-foot setbacks, and let's not have allowing for that single-story cinder block kind of classic box structure. And the reason I show this picture of a Barnes & Noble is because there's an increasing reality that there are developers and retailers, sort of businesses that are willing to come to these kinds of settings. That one in Terre Haute, Indiana, that Barnes & Noble could have been out on the strip next to the Walmart and the Lowe's, but instead they got it to be right next to Indiana State University, so now it's the campus bookstore and there's office space above it. And that helps me because, yeah, that's higher value land than the land out on the edge would have been, but I make more money on it because I've got a multi-story tenants upstairs and so on. So we're seeing this kind of development, and it's not only in Portland and Boulder and Denver and, you know, and that's why I'm showing you Terre Haute, Indiana, and Vancouver, and I know some of you are in communities that are doing equally great stuff, or you've seen that, but let's not let people tell us this only happens in those kinds of specialized places. I think with regard to residential, it breaks my heart to see a sill building, sort of single-family homes, large lot, low density. You know, the Urban Land Institute and the NAR, National Association of Realtors, would say we are overstocked with that kind of housing. We've got plenty of that. It's this other stuff, the more in-town, walkable, maybe single-family. Not everybody wants to be upstairs from retail. Not everybody does want to be upstairs from the Cheesecake Factory. I get it. But, you know, more compact development with the classic, there it is, big wheel sidewalk, because the garages are out back. You know, we know how to do this. We could have our zoning ordinance, our subdivision regs say this is our standard now. Whatever else you do, this is a very practical recommendation I've made to lots of communities all over the country. Anytime you're going to trigger what we historically would have called a traffic impact analysis, whether it's the development of a new Walmart or putting in of a housing subdivision or some mixed use, don't just count cars. We should never again, I believe, we should make the traffic impact analysis obsolete. It should never be done, because anytime you would estimate the number of motor vehicle trips, shouldn't you think about all four modes? Shouldn't we require of the developer that they estimate pedestrian, bicycle, and transit trips as well? Further, not only should we make them estimate them, we should make them actually mitigate for those, right? So if they did a trip count at this Walmart on the left here, and they said, oh, I'm going to generate this many trips, and it's going to lower the level of service at the intersection down to C or D, so we need a signalizer, and we'll pay for that. The developer will, because we know it's our impact. I also say, what about, you know, the transit trips, pedestrian trips, bike trips? Where's the bus shelter? Where's the, you know, yeah, you're going to put in a turn lane and a signal light, but where's the pedestrian connection to the front door? Where's the bike parking? Is there a bicycle lane, sharrows? In other words, we should be asking for mitigation in all four modes. And this is not even a cost to the community. I would argue in most communities, when you trigger a TIA, it is paid for by the developer, right, or the redevelopment. Now, not all work is done by the private sector. I get that. But the point is, stop just counting cars. It's just, this is a no-brainer, I believe. And it's often, in many communities, the beauty of it is the procedural change right at the staff level. May well be just a change on your development checklist. You know, let's start using the term multimodal transportation analysis instead of TIA and expecting them to estimate trips in all four categories. I'm not saying everybody will do a good job of it. I get that we got to push everybody up a learning curve. But even the recent ITE trip generation manual, the one that came out in 2014, August, I think it is, has more information about bike ped trips, transit-oriented development, things like that, transit estimates, than any previous version. It's not perfect data. It's better than no data. Complete streets. I think everybody probably on this call has at least heard the term, familiar with it, the idea that we think of all four users. This is just a follow-on to what I've just said. All four users, pedestrian, bike, transit, motor vehicles, thought about in every time we touch a road. But my point about this is, the quick side note I want to make here is I'm seeing around the country exceptionally innovative and often very low-cost ways to make a street more complete. So these are low-cost curb extensions, which, by the way, the lower two, no negative impact. Car happens to hit that little flexible bollard or that little curbing, no damage. It's paint, it's a little bollard or curbing material, sign paint. The one on the lower left was done as part of a Safe Routes to School project near a school crossing. Admittedly, on the top picture in that little neighborhood in St. Louis, those planters would do some damage to a car, but that's a quiet neighborhood street where you're trying to bring speeds down. But in each case, those are effectively curb extensions, they're traffic calming devices, and they're not super costly, and they're reversible. You could take them out. More examples, community wayfinding, street furnishings like these, the bench on the lower left, which was part of a design contest in that community of Tinley Park, Illinois, or on the right, that parklet. That's a removable wooden deck built by a local VOTEC school, vocational school students constructed this beautiful thing. It now serves as on-street seating for a coffee shop that's nearby, has created a little park-like feel on that bridge in downtown Montpelier. These are all examples of the kinds of things that we're seeing communities do to make more complete streets that are not dauntingly expensive and do still impact the behavior. Having said that, in Anaconda, Montana, they were not sure whether that would work. So America Walks, Pedestrian Advocacy Group, worked with the local health coalition. So that remember the bubble chart I showed a few moments ago, those circles, that exists in Anaconda thanks to the Department of Health having done a state-level training. So these people come home and they say, we want to do curb extensions. And then there's all this, well, no, we're not so sure. Well, it turns out that pharmacy, the picture of the building in the background there, was opening an ice cream shop, window out onto the street. They said, let's try a curb extension right in front of our store. So somebody brought their living room furniture out and whatever they could find, and they made a curb extension, the bump out there with seating in it and so on. Fire chief is part of their coalition, as well he should be, and he's a little concerned, can our biggest truck in the fleet make the turn? So somebody said, well, go get it. So they brought the biggest fire truck out, and they adjusted the radius of curvature at the intersection to make sure that truck could make the turn there. The point is, this little pop-up test opened the door so that when the DOT said, hey, this road is up for repaving this summer, it turns out, summer 2015, they said, the DOT said, if you've tested this and you've got positive response from the business owner, so we're not going to get pushback, we'd be willing to consider incorporating some of this kind of stuff into our design. Even if they're just painted out curb extensions with little bollards on them, way better than nothing. Having said that, that's easier to do if a planner or an engineer thinks their job description includes these 3 key words right at the top, the health, safety, and welfare of the community. And if it isn't, particularly in the case of the engineer, only about improving level of service. In other words, if our only benchmark of performance is level of service, we will always widen the lane, straighten it, do anything we can to move more cars faster. But what if our benchmark performance measure is minimizing total trips or vehicle miles traveled or increasing pedestrian, bike, and transit trips or assessing the heat, which I'll show you in a moment? So in Nashville, Tennessee, the MPO there has said effectively in how they score proposed projects for the transportation improvement plan, they've said exactly this. We are not just looking for improved motor vehicle level of service. We want to see impacts to pedestrian, bicycle, transit, goods and services, not just the single occupancy vehicle. And they will score better on their scoring priority list. And indeed, you know, they've told me they will not be funding just LOS only, level of service only projects that just say we're going to improve level of service. That's not going to get the money because, you know, 60% of their score now consider these broader impacts. I alluded a moment ago to increasing the heat. And HEAT is an acronym for the Health Economic Analysis Tool. Let me say it again, Health Economic Analysis Tool for Walking and Cycling. It's actually been organized by the WHO, World Health Organization. The website's on the bottom there. The thing is pretty simple. It allows you to estimate a number of pedestrian and bicycle trips that a project might generate, an average trip length, and using public health data on chronic disease risk and attainment of the physical activity guidelines, will give a statistical value of the life years that have been saved by virtue of more people walking and biking. So a simple example, we're trying to decide whether we put this pedestrian bridge in that connects this employment complex to downtown. It's going to cost X. Is it worth it? How many pedestrian trips might that pedestrian bridge generate? Well, we can estimate that number and the duration of those trips. It takes 15 minutes to walk from that office complex to the downtown area. We think about this many employees will do this on a regular basis to go to lunch, errands, you know, businesses in the downtown area. We can plug those into the HEAT tool, and it will crank out just based on a bunch of defaults, many of which are adjustable if you have unique data to your region. And you'll get a number, and that dollar value is the statistical value of the life years saved. Traffic engineers, of course, use this commonly when they're estimating, is there a value to putting in the guardrail? How many lives will be saved? How many fatalities forestalled? What's the dollar value of those? If that's higher than the value of the guardrail, we put it in. An example. Massachusetts Bay Transit Authority, the MBTA, which is the Greater Boston Transit Authority, in 2012 was proposing fare increases and service reductions, including eliminating weekend service and so on. The MAPC, which is the regional planning entity here, did a health impact analysis. And they were looking at everything from additional time in traffic, delay, you know, based on the increased congestion as fewer transit trips, to they added a heat calculation. They estimated actually health, you know, the cost associated with reduced physical activity as fewer people were walking and bicycling. Of all the costs associated, cost of additional mortality and hospitalizations, collisions, fuel burning, air quality impact, carbon emissions, additional time in traffic was the top one. This was an infographic that they created after they finished the analysis. Additional time in traffic was the first. And there were two scenarios. That's why you see $2 figures for each one. And the second highest cost associated with this reduction in transit service was going to be cost of lives lost due to decreased physical activity. Big numbers, because if a significant number of people fewer are walking and bicycling, walking to transit, then there are real dollars associated with the health costs associated with that. And this is a very conservative estimate. My point is, what if we said let's maximize or minimize that negative number or maximize the positive savings every time we do a project? Okay, last couple. Comprehensive trails, all I'm going to say about trails is this. Let's not just build transportation trails, let's build trails for, recreation trails. Let's build them for transportation. I love that the Rapid Creek Trail is a priority snow clearing route in Rapid City, South Dakota, because so many kids walk and bike to school. They say, if we don't clear it, those kids would be getting driven, those cars would be in front of the schools, and then we'd have to be screwing around, dancing around those cars, trying to plow the roads. So when we're plowing our arterial roads, we make our life easier if we also plow the sidewalk because it keeps our motor vehicle traffic down. The whole field of transportation demand management, I think, has huge promise. The Bike-Friendly Communities program is a wonderful one. You can go to the League of American Bicyclists website to learn more of bike-friendly communities, bike-friendly businesses, bike-friendly campuses. The beautiful thing about the rating system is it not only scores you from honorable mention up to platinum, it also says, here's how you can move up. So if we give you a bronze now, here's what it would take to get to silver. And I'm intrigued by the innovation that's going on around the country. So bike share programs, not just in the big cities. Yeah, I love Boston's Hubway. It's really cool. I'm a member. But I love that Grinnell, Iowa, and Naperville, Illinois, and Salem, Massachusetts have little ones that operate out of the colleges or local businesses acting as the hubs. There's lots of interesting stuff. In North Adams, Massachusetts, where they designed an iconic bike rack. You can see there it's an NAMA for North Adams, Massachusetts. They're being fabricated by a local Votech school, installed by the city. Or in Blue Island, Illinois, the Great Bicycle Skills and Safety Training Program, which includes bike construction and repair. If you stay in for the full length of the program, pass it, you end up keeping the bike. They target low-income kids, and you keep the bike. That said, I think one of the strongest things we can do around transportation demand management is actually make parking pay for itself. This comes up again and again and again in the research. You all know it. There's no news here. But I consider this a health initiative, because the moment we make parking cost what it really costs to the user, then the incentives to do the other modes, that is walk, bike, and take transit, become aligned with the economics, the economic reality. And I think we've got to really, really push for that. And last of my 5 in that article was safe routes to school. And my only point about this is I don't even bother talking to a community about safe routes to school if the administration isn't on board. In other words, if I'm just talking to the PE and the wellness people, we're going to end up setting up walking school buses and do nice feel-good things and walk to school day, but we're not going to change any policy. We're not going to change any environment. We're not going to change the pick-up and drop-off procedures. But you get the administration, you get the principal on board, and you're going to do what they did in this school in Columbia, Missouri, West Boulevard Elementary, where they actually developed an off-site pick-up and drop-off location on the other side of a park that adjoins the school. And in some schools, they've not only created those off-site locations, they've put in place a 5-minute safety delay. So if you pick up your kid in front of the school, the car sits for 5 minutes. But the kids who are walking and bicycling, including those walking to the remote drop-off site or pickup site, those kids are all released. So you move all the pedestrians off the grounds before you let the cars flow. Needless to say, kids start to say to their parents, hey, don't pick me up at school. Let me walk over there. Let me walk home with the walking school bus. Which is far more effective. So you've got to combine policy with the infrastructure. My final point, we have to go use the system. We can talk about this theoretically, and we can say, yeah, bike and transit. Well, if we're not out there doing it ourselves at least once in a while, then we don't know how hard it is or easy it is. So if you have a transit system in your community, get on it. Even if you don't have to, or if it's less convenient, once in a while, use it. Because if it is less convenient, then maybe you ought to figure out that what we can do to make it more convenient, because the people who have to be on it are dealing with those same convenience challenges. Walk your kid to school, or to a tour from school, or tour from a remote drop-off area, and offer to bring some others. Try to commute to your job if you possibly can once in a while without a car. Carpool, walk, bike, take transit, whatever combination you can create. Because only if we're out there doing it do we know the realities of how easy or hard it is. I mean this sincerely. And you can say, well, I live really far away. Okay, do you go to work? You have to drive to work. At work, do you sometimes get in your car to drive to get lunch, go to the bank, post office, that you could eliminate that vehicle trip and try walking instead, so that you understand what works about the network? Because I have this final point. Frequently, I can get people through this whole argument, and they'll be, okay, you've proven it to me. It's right. We can build it. They will come. Health matters. The environment, blah, blah, blah. The economy, sure, there are economic benefits. We don't understand how to do this. This is technically beyond us. I don't have people in my department that know how to do it. That's not true. We have good answers, and we have great guides out there. I can't help but remind you of the NACDO, National Association of City Transportation Officials, Urban Street Design Guide, Urban Bikeway Design Guide, as recent examples of great guidance that is out there. Really innovative communities are actually adopting these, referencing these in their roadway guidelines and their design guidelines, and saying, yes, these are valid approaches, designs to use in our community. The second one is we can't pay for this stuff. It's too expensive. This complete streets thing is nice, but it's going to be vastly expensive. That picture in the bottom there of paint and an installed bike rack and a curb extension makes that street more complete than if those two things weren't there. They do not cost a lot. There are low-cost ways to start to at least dip your toe and make first progress. I'm not saying you can make a comprehensive solution to everything. I'm saying it is not a fair reason not to move ahead. Don't let people give you the financial rebuff. And the reason I'm so adamant about this, and some of you who've heard me speak before know I say this all the time, it is because we are raising a generation of kids who are going to be the first in modern society to end up with statistically shorter life expectancies than their parents. That's my daughter and son, who are now 17 and 19. And I've frozen them in time at 3 and 5, I tell people, because they are so cute then. But more importantly, because they remind me that this generation will end up having as much as a 2-year shorter life expectancy than us, not because of Ebola or avian flu, but because they're less physically active and they eat crummier diets. So it's not okay to just go along to get along and keep doing what we've done, because that's what the ordinance says, that's what the board wants, that's the way we've always done it, that's what the developers expect. None of those are valid excuses to keep building places where kids can't be free-range kids. We can do better. We know how. So, privileged to visit with you. I'm honored that your organizations, were willing to put up with a hour-long tirade from me on this, and I hope you've gotten one useful thing out of some of what I've said here. And I'm happy to take some questions or to chat with people if you guys would like. But if you're exhausted, I understand that too.
Thanks so much, Mark. This has been it's been an inspiring tirade, and I've really enjoyed it. We do have a few questions. First off, a comment from Steve, which I think you'll enjoy. He says, "Preach, brother."
Thank you, Steve.
And
we gotta believe in this stuff for starters, right, man?
And Erica says, "I would be standing and clapping after this presentation if I thought that Mark could see me." So, Erica, Mark can see you.
Yeah, and you look great. Although I'm surprised you're watching in your pajamas, but that's cool. Erica, hey, whatever. It's good.
So we have some questions. I've got a bunch of questions, but I want to go straight to the attendees' questions. Regarding the MBTA heat study, well, actually it was done by MAPC, the Metropolitan Planning Council,
right.
But they were analyzing what MBTA was proposing. Ellen asks, what happened with the Boston MBTA heat study? Did they end up reducing service or changing their minds in response to the data?
Oh, God, it's the right question, and tragically they did not. We couldn't convince them, but after a while they went back and they've at least restored the weekend service, which was part of what was taken away, and they're working back toward the increased service. Now, you may have heard total disaster over the storm this winter, the storms that Boston had, and we are hopeful that the combination of these two things will cause a major sea change. That there's a lot of talk about our neglect of our regional transit system. This will be part of the argument, the recent collapse during the winter weather, but they had already begun moving back toward restoring some of the weekend service and reduced services. So it didn't carry the day in the moment, but it's been a powerful piece of the argument and continues to be. Good question.
Of course, there was record snowfall in Boston this past winter.
Yes, we got hammered by the snow. What we've realized is we've not been maintaining the system, right? We've not been investing in fundamental maintenance and upgrades to the system, so we got, it was right on the margin, so the snow just put it over the edge.
Okay, so Abby asks, what was the book Mark just mentioned? And she was referring to Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone.
Oh, yeah.
And I wonder if you could talk about that, and also the follow-up book that he wrote with Lou Feldstein, Better Together.
Yes. So the first one, it's not unlike Kunstler's book, A Geography of Nowhere and Home from Nowhere, which I'd also put on my recommendation list. So let me do Kunstler quickly. Geography of Nowhere was his complaint about suburbia. Home from Nowhere was his sort of look at the New Urbanist Manifesto, basically. So if you're going to read one of those, I'd read James Howard Kunstler's Home from Nowhere, which is really, just a readable telling of the CNU, the New Urbanist approach. And it's similar with Putnam. The first book, Bowling Alone, sort of asked this question, why don't we bowl in leagues anymore? That's why the title. And he says it's this reduction of social capital, community engagement, which has all sorts of costs. People aren't engaged in, scout troops and their local municipal government and things like that. And he does point to suburban-style development as one of the very powerful culprits. In other words, as we've moved from houses that are up at the street with front porches so we talk to each other, we went to suburban homes that have back porches inside fenced yards so we talked only to ourselves. We didn't connect. So the term he coined was social capital, or that he really, sort of emphasized this reduction in social capital, community engagement, and then in the final one, Better Together, he tries to talk about remedies, right? He talks about sort of solutions. So Putnam, P-U-T-N-A-M, I think he's still at Harvard, and I recommend any of those 4 books to talk about these sorts of broader social themes around community design.
Okay, so we have a cautionary comment from Tara, and this gets to the notion of changing infrastructure and community involvement. And she says, I worry that when planning infrastructure design like road diets, that we're not first taking into consideration what the community wants. Recently, our state installed bike lanes and narrowed a 2-lane to 1 with center turn lane design in one of our city neighborhoods. Both peds and drivers hate it and even find it a bit dangerous. They hate it because even with stoplights, changes make the road more difficult to cross. And she says, we must always consider real community input and only offer planning design where it is desired and appreciated and balances need for change with use by the community residents.
Sure. Couldn't agree more. That's one of the reasons I'm a huge fan of these walk audits and doing them there, on the site. So, sort of, and again, the walk audit doesn't solve the problem Tara just outlined, although it might have given people a chance to get out, walk it, talk about what they did and didn't like about the current alignment, like, well, this works well, or this is where the intersection of the crossing is hard, this is where we are hesitant to let our kids cross. And who knows, maybe the lane reduction was the right answer, but maybe, having been out there and learned from them where their concerns were, you would have said, not so much about the lane reduction, it's more about these 3 specific crossings, signal timing, median island, maybe we need a mid-block because it's not at the intersection the crossing is trouble. You don't get any of that if you aren't engaged with the community at the very local level and from the real stakeholders. Harder to do, by the way, in my experience, low-income communities where people are working 1.5 and 2 jobs, or they aren't necessarily socially engaged in these kinds of conversations, which only makes our obligation greater to do just what Tara challenges us to do, which is say, okay, what are the social entities? What are the entities that might get residents engaged? Maybe it's a nearby church or a Boys and Girls Club, a community center, which has to act as the host of our planning event, right? Not just at the public library downtown or at the at the planning offices, municipal offices, town hall. Maybe we got to go right to that neighborhood and have the event in the church basement right on the very street she's talking about.
So
I don't mean that as panacea, but I'm acknowledging that I think the point she makes is dead on.
So following up on that and recognizing that there are different communities, this is something that I faced recently. My town is getting its first roundabout. We're very excited. The first time I drove through the intersection years ago, I thought this is a great place for a roundabout, and it's going to happen. But recently I've been working, helping to produce a film on blind wayfinding. And it's been brought to my attention that roundabouts and some other more innovative transportation designs pose a real problem for people who are blind. The sound of traffic when it's arranged in a linear fashion is an important cue for people who are blind.
Right.
And also they need to travel as much as possible in straight lines, and you don't get that with a roundabout.
That's right. And I've had some conversations with folks that are sort of work in that field. You still hearing me okay? I had to switch phone battery. So my understanding is this, that sort of, as with everything, again, we're back to the no single panacea, right? Signalized intersections, one of the big challenges around them, and the ones where we're often seeing roundabouts replace them, is lots of conflict points, right? That's what the engineer would tell you. Say, well, the problem with the signalized intersection, the one who's a roundabout advocate would say, you've got the right turning, the left turning, and so unless you've got an auditory signal, which we should ideally for the visually impaired person, and then a full stop phase and no right on red, all right, you got to do an awful lot to eliminate all the risks for the visually impaired or the blind pedestrian, because the right on red still, then I've got everything going, I've got them in the right phase and everything else. Give me right on red, and I can still have a conflict point there. Having said that, my understanding is probably sort of the roundabout advocates would make this case. They would say properly designed roundabouts bring speeds way down, and the pedestrian crossing is always at least 1 to 2 vehicle lengths set back from the actual stop line, right? So that entering vehicles are generally being forced to stop by the vehicle that's stopping at the yield line, and by virtue of the physical deflection, their speed is brought way down. Departing vehicles, exiting vehicles, are being are coming off the circle, so they're slowest, so they have response time for the pedestrian who steps out. Some have talked about, and I don't know whether this is being tested yet, somebody told me recently they were going to do some tests, and I don't know if it's true, and she may know this, that they've talked about doing rumble strips on the exit sides so that you're getting an auditory cue right when a vehicle is exiting the circle. I don't know if that's a good solution or not. I'm just talking about the kinds of innovation that I hear going on around roundabouts, in particular around this issue. But the biggest argument I've heard is that the thing that a roundabout does to work well, it brings speeds way down by definition, which provides response time, driver's response time, so that if the auditory cue isn't sufficient, in other words, if the blind pedestrian does happen to step out because the car that's exiting the circle is still 2 and 3 car lengths away, they have enough time to respond to that. The motor vehicle does. I don't know if that's a sufficient answer, and I have not seen anybody show data that says we've got our large numbers of visually impaired pedestrians being hit at circles. By the same token, that might be because they're just very specifically avoiding them because they are so problematic for a blind pedestrian. So I think this is an unanswered question. I do think there's some thoughtful dialogue going on and people talking about either are there technical solutions to that, or does a properly designed circle sufficiently deal with this issue? Do you have any further thoughts on that, Ben? Do you know anything else about it that you understand?
No, but I think we continue to learn. And, one of the blind advocates that I've been working with here in New Hampshire is a guy by the name of Randy Pierce. In fact, he just ran the Boston Marathon, posted a really good time.
Cool.
He talks about roundabouts as a problem, but he also focuses on the need for training. And I wonder if combinations of design and training for people with visual impairments about how to navigate a roundabout, because it is different. I wonder if that might help too.
Yeah, that's a distinct possibility. That's right.
So we have a couple of questions here from folks relating to the prevalence of social media and screen time as a barrier to physical activity. So Christine says, I live and walk in a bike-friendly community. How can I convince my 17-year-old to leave his Xbox and PC and hop on his bike?
Yeah. So we're back to the top of the pyramid, right? The behavioral pyramid. At some point, you just got to say, turn it off, unplug the damn thing, In other words, we are. So two things. One point about that, though, is this. Many people are ready to blame those media and say, well, the kids have gotten sucked in and we let them, and that's the problem. In other words, we have to do something about those, and I agree, and, do so with my own kids. I sort of say, have you been outside today yet? What's the deal? Right, and get off that thing. And I think it's fair. If they're in my house, I'm still the parent, I can do that. But we're talking parenting here. Here's the other interesting thing, though. There's some question on the population scale how much this problem was that we became comfortable as we became fearful of the outdoor world. Those devices became a comfortable childcare, right? That people deferred to. Well, at least he's where I know I know he is. He's safe. He's in front of the screen. He's inside the house. He's not out on that dangerous road, or he's not out, doing something I don't want him to do, or being abducted. And so, to some degree, there's a question about whether we made that problem worse by virtue of using the screen, the digital world, as a default, childcare device. Whereas, man, when I was a kid, I was told to get out the door on a Saturday morning. Get out of the house. I do not want to see you till lunchtime, or frequently dinner, or in my own case, tomorrow.
So we have
and I'm not making light of that. I mean, there's a lot of writing about this now. There are a lot of people asking interesting questions. But I would strongly argue we can't just say it's the devices themselves. It's about our social norms, our willingness to have allowed them to become these dependencies, right? That, kids that's how they connect. My son, quick side note, just to give the counterpoint to hers, recently gave up an iPhone and went back to a flip phone, which I also still carry. I do it in part because I just cannot be that. I don't want to be that accessible to email, literally. It would be overwhelming to me. He said, he's a freshman out at UC Berkeley. He said, I walked around campus and all I did was see kids walking around with their heads down, like literally not seeing one another. He said, and I said, I don't want to be that guy. So he's testing this summer, not having his iPhone. Who knows? Maybe it'll be a little fad. He'll do it for 3 months and he'll go back. But it's an interesting observation that he is seeing what's happening with that generation and how they interact or don't.
That's fascinating. So
Yeah,
you mentioned earlier that the Surgeon General would be coming out with a walking and walkability guide this
right,
summer.
right.
And my thought was that so much of what we've got has already been built. So we have this question from Richard, and he asks, what techniques, retrofits, have worked best in suburban environments?
Well, that's a great question, and I think, boy, the jury is way out on this. We have way much more work to do. Having said that, everything from the lane reductions, sort of the restriping of what's out there seems to hold great promise in those sorts of settings, in my mind. That combined with things like access control, what a traffic engineer would call access control and those sorts of things. Another example is punching through cul-de-sacs. In other words, starting to take opportunities, and I'm even aware of some communities that have literally looked for opportunities, and when the properties at the end of a cul-de-sac become available, literally getting involved in the property transition, even as much as buying a home, putting an easement down, connecting a sidewalk, a trail from cul-de-sac A to cul-de-sac B, opening it back up. Sticking to our guns on what we often say in our ordinances. I'm amazed the number of ordinances that require, when a subdivision is built, stub ends be left for the adjoining subdivision, and then they're not connected because subdivision A, first one in, when subdivision B, second one in comes, they say, no, we don't want it, we don't want to bring the traffic. Well, if you design the roadways in there with appropriate traffic copying, think mini circles rather than four-way stop signs and chicanes and things like that, then the cut-through traffic is not going to be cut-through traffic, it's going to be local traffic. So you do that, and then B, you stick to your guns and you make them connect, right? If that's what the ordinance said and that's what's in the subdivision regs, you do it. So in other words, some of it was us just abdicating responsibility when we did this work in developing the subdivisions. I would also say housing policy intrigues me. So we in our town put in place both and we're not really suburban, we're really more of a small self-contained community, but it's an example to be used in, which is accessory dwellings. So the notion of allowing people to put apartments over garages, in basements, I think that that's going to be one of the things that's going to show a lot more promise over time, because what's going to happen is you can increase net density and mix of housing, sort of income level in a neighborhood. Imagine a suburban neighborhood where big homes, and I couldn't afford to buy one. But if I could have a little apartment over the garage, a little income from that, I might be able to buy the home. Plus, there's now a person who can afford to be in that apartment. So we have three income levels: the outright buyer, the buyer with income, and the person who's actually in the rental unit. We've even seen communities make those be affordable accessory dwellings. So if you keep the rental level below a certain portion of median income, you can put in the apartment by right. If it's going to be a market rate apartment, then you might have to go through a special permit process. This is kind of esoteric sort of housing policy stuff, but it's the kind of stuff I'm seeing being used as people try to rethink what kind of net densities we can get in suburbia, and sort of, because now if I could get that density up, maybe I could support transit in an otherwise suburban zone where I couldn't have. And then the last piece is, I'm just going to make my own little personal pitch here. This is more on the nutrition side. We have these big-ass yards in these neighborhoods, excuse me, but I've turned my front yard into and it's a small one. I'm in a much smaller neighborhood. I'm on a quarter-acre lot, so 4 units per acre. Moderate density, right? Moderately low. But my front yard is now an edible landscape. I got 5 fruit trees. I got a large garden. I got, sort of a strawberry and a raspberry patch. I think we're going to see really innovative stuff happening with suburban design over the next couple of decades. As soon as oil gets back to its real price, a couple $100 a barrel, people are going to really be thinking about these things.
So kind of concluding this, we have this question from Gregory. How do you counter the argument that more people are starting to use bicycles for transportation purposes as opposed to recreational purposes, primarily due to economic decline rather than health-conscious decision-making? And I guess the following up on that would be, if as the economy improves, are we going to see fewer people biking and more people back in their cars?
Yeah. So everybody's talking about the VMT having dropped, right? It started down in 2008 when we hit $4 a gallon and the recession hit, right? And then per capita VMT, vehicle miles traveled, has stayed downward trending. And yes, I think quite rightly, is that downward trend going to end as the economy comes back? So couple of things. One, we could have a really cool economic discussion. I minored in that at MIT when I was studying engineering, about whether it's going to come back in the way everybody thought, right? Maybe we're in a new era here, and it's just not going to be that same kind of economy, the sort of the housing boom and all of those things. There's a part of me that almost says we don't want that because it created those false sort of signals, market signals, that created what we've been talking about, right, for this whole conversation. So, A, there's a question whether that kind of a comeback will ever happen. B, oil prices are probably the biggest driver in that process, right? So, as I just alluded to, will we see oil prices come back to what market levels ought to be? There are so many open questions about that. But I think there's an interesting fundamental shift in the actual preferences of millennials that are a significant part of the answer to his question, let alone the aging baby boom population. These two population chunks could drive the answer to his conversation, to his question, in the positive way. You know, so as we boomers age and say, geez, oh man, I'm just sick of driving around suburbia. I really do want to live in a place where I have some options. And the millennials who are coming out and saying, you know, I can Uber my way to anywhere that I want if I'm in a medium to higher density urban environment. And I'm going to actually choose to be, even if I'm in more rural America, I'm going to be in a small town, not out in the middle of nowhere. I think it leaves open the question, and I don't take the pessimistic view. In fact, I take the hopeful view that, as I say, oil prices get back to where they should be, and there are enough market signals combined with the actual social sort of preferences of those two population groups that we don't lose this positive trend on biking for transportation. We'll see, but let's hope that's true.
And that's a great note to end on. We are out of time. We were not able to get to all the questions, but for folks who have more questions, there you see on your screen Mark's email address, mark.fenton@verizon.net. I encourage you to shoot him a message. Mark, this has been a terrific discussion, and I've really appreciated your passionate appeal to us all as planners to do better in the work that we do in promoting walkability and really conceiving of things from a public health lens. To everyone who's just recognized that this has been approved for 1.5 CM credits, you can go to your dashboard, select activities by provider, select the Michigan chapter at today's sponsor, and then select the title of this, An Urgent Call for Healthy Communities, or search by event number 30205. And with that, we'll close out today's session. And again, thanks a lot, Mark. We've appreciated it.
A privilege to be with you guys. I'm honored that you guys took some time to be with us today. Thanks so much, Ben.